wanted to talk to you a little bit today about, and make sure everybody gets a sheet here, because I'm not doing this by myself. I'm not doing it solo, okay? So you'll be an honorary Kentuckian if you sing this song. My program today is on the Kentuckians and Tennesseans in the Battle of New Orleans, and if we weren't here, we might be singing God Save the Queen, because, I mean, we really were important. Not just Kentuckians, but the Tennesseans as well, which we comprise the biggest part of Andrew Jackson's army. When we look at this, again, I come from Kentucky. People have a lot of misconceptions about Kentucky. They say, oh, they're the state with 4 million happy people and 15 last names. We were talking today about who was the professor this morning about inbreeding, in the area. He said he was a product of that. And I said, wait a minute, I'm from Kentucky. No, I don't know. But anyway, I will tell you, we've got good things in Kentucky, like tobacco, whiskey, hemp, fast horses and corn-fed girls. They'll all five get you into trouble. But we do have a song that came out of this period, and we'll start off with that, if we would. It's called The Hunters of Kentucky. And if you look on the front of that, and, right now I'm saying that and trying to, I need a sheet as well. If you would bring me one, Michelle, I would love to have one, because I can almost remember it, but if I'm leading the song, I better have the words. On the front of that, thank you, is a half horse, half alligator. And I had to elongate it and shrink it a little so I could make the print more eye-friendly. But that was a symbol of what the riverboat people from my part of the state and upriver call themselves. I'm half horse, half alligator, and I can whoop anybody. And this song was first performed by Noah Ludlow. It was written by Samuel Woodworth. It was a contrafactum, like Michelle sang this morning, the Star-Spangled Banner, the Ode to Anacreon. I mean, a lot of songs were done that way, and you just took an existing tune and then put the words to it. And so it goes a little like this. I'll hit the chorus. I want you to come in on, ye gentlemen and ladies fair who grace this famous city, that's New Orleans. Just listen if you've time to spare while I rehearse a ditty. This was written in the tune of the Irish ballads, and the actual beginning of the song was the unfortunate Miss Bailey, who was married or met a young, bold man from Halifax. He left her in the family way, and she hanged herself. It wasn't a very nice, but this one's a little more uplifting, and it is about the Battle of New Orleans. It goes like this. Let's hope. Just listen if you've time to spare while I rehearse a ditty. Conceive yourself quite lucky, for 'tis not often that you see. Here it goes like this. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Join in, ye gentlemen and ladies fair, who grace this famous city. Just listen if you've time to spare while I rehearse a ditty. And for the opportunity, conceive yourself quite lucky, for 'tis not often that you see a hunter from Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. So this was an actual song that was sung. Actually, Andrew Jackson began using it in his campaign in 1824 and 1828. Kind of odd, because hunters from Kentucky, Henry Clay was from Kentucky, and they hated each other. When Andrew Jackson was on his deathbed, they asked him, do you have any regrets in your life, sir? 2, that I did not hang John C. Calhoun and I did not shoot Henry Clay. Isn't that horrible to say on your deathbed? But let me tell you, here's some interesting facts. Kentucky had really put themselves through the ringer. 31 of our counties are named for people who fought in the war, but 9 actually for those killed in the war, and 8 of those at River Raisin. The biggest thing is 64% of all Kentuckians that were killed in battle, Americans killed in battle, were Kentuckians. There were 17 other states in the Union Kentucky was one state. We lost 64% of the casualties. The other 17 lost 36%. Now that sounds, were we bad fighters? Actually, we were not. We were very good fighters. Were the battles fought in Kentucky? Not one. We went everywhere else. Moving on, Governor Charles Scott, mainly it was because we were so enthusiastic, we got ourselves into trouble. When Charles Scott, the governor of Kentucky, called for 2,500 troops, he got over 8,000 that joined. Enthusiasm was high. Kentucky was a western state then. And they were saying, Henry Clay and a lot of the people were saying, on to Canada, on to Canada. We conquer Canada, we're going to have a bunch of western states to offset those snobby Federalists in the East. And so that is exactly what was happening. Henry Clay said, it would be a mere frontiersman's frolic to go up there and to take Canada. And said, I think Kentucky could do it by themselves. Well, did we learn? Our governor, Isaac Shelby, he too was enthusiastic. He joined his troops. He said, I won't go. I called for 2,500 troops, but I will not go without leading my men. He goes up into Canada. 62 years old then. They called him Old Daddy. But he rode his horse all the way there and back. He even found Kentucky's mascot. It was a pig. Can you believe it? It was fighting in the streets of Newport, and the Kentuckians cheered it on, and then when it won, they cheered it, and the defeated pig ran off, and this other one bugged them to death and tried to ride the boats across the Ohio River, and ended up, because they wouldn't let it on the rafts, it swam the Ohio and collapsed in the mud, and they took pity on the pig, and they left it the first day, and it came into camp at night, and then they adopted it as the mascot. Kentuckians actually fought in the Navy. A lot of people don't know that. But when Oliver Hazard Perry was fighting up on Lake Erie, he needed men. He had the ships, he had the gunpowder, the guns, the rope, but he did not have men. And the Kentuckians said, we'll fight. So 100 of them actually served in the Navy. Moving on, we fought valiantly all along Canada, up in the north, and we suffered heavily at the Battle of the River Raisin, Frenchtown. And that became the battle cry for the war. It was shouted down here by Kentuckians in the battle, remember the raisin. It's like, remember the Alamo, remember the raisin is the battle cry for that war. We also are very proud in Kentucky to know that, when Francis Scott Key wrote his, national anthem, he was writing that, this was the actual flag or picture of it that flew over Fort McHenry. It was a 15-star, 15-stripe flag, the Kentucky battle flag. So, when we like to say that song was written to a Kentucky flag. They actually call it that. We suffered very badly at Fort Meigs. We lost most of our casualties at River Raisin and Fort Meigs. That 64% was mostly in the north. Here we are dedicating a monument, the 2nd Regiment, Kentucky Volunteers. I'm part of that militia. This is some of the militia outfit that they wear. And we are also proud. We claim that Richard Mentor Johnson, who became the 9th Vice President of the U.S., killed Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames River. William Henry Harrison, this is really, I think he sums up, the governor of Indiana Territory, sums up what our problem was. He says, rarely does a general ever have to complain of the excessive ardor of his troops. But in the case where the Kentucky militia is involved, that's the entire opposite. It's the source of all their misfortune. Their bravery is actually more, dangerous to them than, cowardice. We were interested in New Orleans all along because New Orleans was our outlet, because our river systems drain into the Ohio River, and then it comes to the Mississippi. So flatboaters truly depended upon New Orleans having an outlet, and it was being blockaded during the war. So a lot of our war hawks at that time period were from Kentucky. The British had launched a 3-pronged campaign here at Lake Champlain. They burned the capital, and they descended upon New Orleans. Vice Admiral Cochrane had a fleet of over 60 some odd warships, including ships of the line, invasion troops up to 14,000 men, and commanding them was Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington and the hero of Salamanca, and he was placed in command of the forces. New Orleans at that time was the 5th largest city in the United States. It was the key to the entire Mississippi Valley. Certainly the French knew that when they colonized. The Spanish and the English definitely were not going to recognize Napoleon's sale of Louisiana territory to America. To defend this city was Andrew Jackson, probably one of the hardest men, that you would ever find. In fact, he had already earned from his troops the name Old Hickory. New Orleans was a source of fascination for people coming down river to sell their yearly goods. It was like visiting a European city, because it did look European and we saw some beautiful architecture earlier this morning. New Orleans, on a busy day, when you came down here, sometimes that flatboat, you could have hopped across those flatboats for 1.25 miles. And they were backed up sometimes 3 deep. And then around the bend, you had your large ocean-going vessels because it's a deep water port. New Orleans was starting to realize that cotton was going to be big. And we heard a talk today on granulated sugar. That had just taken over and supplanted indigo. And so we're seeing a lot of the brick refineries coming up here. Very, very wealthy. Moving on, Kentuckians, we like to sell our healthy products here. Tobacco, for one. And we packed that into giant hogsheads. And what you did, those hogsheads could be, 5 feet, 4.5 feet tall. It could weigh up to 1,100 pounds of pressed tobacco. And we sold that downriver. Another thing, another health product, hemp. And that's an actual shock of hemp. We sold it, of course, for rope and cotton sacking. And especially after the War of 1812, cotton bagging is going to be one of our biggest things going on. And, of course, another very healthy product, bourbon whiskey, manufactured for the Bourbons down there in New Orleans. And so these were all put on flatboats, and they said you can ride those things like a magic carpet all the way to New Orleans and come back a rich man. But a lot of people, how are you going to get back? You had to come up the Natchez Trace, and there were people waiting for you because they knew you had money. And so it became one of the most dangerous highways in America. Andrew Jackson arrived in New Orleans. The Army, or the government, gave him 990 blue coats to fight those 14,000 redcoats. Can you imagine? He wasn't all by himself, though. He would establish his official headquarters at 106 East Royal Street, but he could most be often found at Maspero's Coffee House and Exchange. The upper floor is where a lot of that was going on. Down here were your bars and grills, and down in the basement were it was the slave exchange. A lot of history in that still standing structure. Jackson looked at the troops and said, good gosh, what have I got to defend here? We're looking at Mobile. I mean, he was trying to defend the entire coast. He was certain the British were going to come to New Orleans. But he looked at it and he said, there's not one, look at these maps. These are just like, I can't tell what's water and what is land. And he said, the locals didn't have he tried to get good descriptions from the locals, and he said, well, even the pirates know more than anyone else. And of course they said, well, we need to talk about that. And we heard a really interesting talk from Ron about the Jean Lafitte. And they said, well, we need to have you enlist his aid. Jackson at first was very hesitant to do that. The British had already made entreaties to the disaffected groups in New Orleans. Just a few years before, or 1 year before the war started, you had the German Coast Slave Rebellion, which was very, very a serious affair. And the British were looking, for allies. They weren't, uneducated in that way. But I will tell you, Andrew Jackson did have support of the local citizenry. Jean-Baptiste Ploche. Now, if I mispronounce these French names, remember, I am from Kentucky. Daniel Boone couldn't spell the word bear. D. Boone, kill a bar on this tree. But Major Jean-Baptiste Ploch's Battalion d'Orléans, they fought in the French, and a lot of them had the blue uniforms of France. There were a lot of people here in New Orleans that couldn't come to grips with the fact that the stars and stripes were flying over the Cabildo. There was Denis de Laurent, and some of the other plantations and civic owners provided armed militias in various formats. Andrew Jackson sent numerous requests for troops and weapons. A militia of 1,500 Tennesseans was raised, and he said, get here as fast as you can. And so they actually traveled about 1,300 miles in 30 days on rafts, and they brought their gunsmiths. The Tennesseans were armed to the teeth. Many of them had a rifle, a pistol, a tomahawk, and a knife. They were ready for business, and they had their gunsmiths, they had forges on their rafts, so they were on their way. Commanding the troops would be friends of Jackson's. He had already done a lot of fighting with General John Coffee, in the Indian Wars, and then General William Carroll, Billy Carroll. And they come down in a number of regiments. I won't go through all of those. And so then Governor Shelby said, look, I've received this letter from Andrew Jackson. We need to get some troops down there. So he called for another 2,500 soldiers. We had already lost those casualties. We were in a bad way. The total strength of the Kentucky Detached Militia was 2,256 men. We didn't have a way to get down there. That was another thing. It was really an issue. We had to actually buy the boats. And one of our quartermasters did that. He chipped in his own money, $10,000, and bought boats. And the guy that sold them to him was laughing because there was a bunch of, they were lemons. They fell apart, and they had to be rebuilt at the mouth of the Cumberland River. The Kentuckian, that was the first thing, how to get to New Orleans. Who was going to pay them? Were they going to get guns or not? Were they going to get camp equipment? And the answer to all of that was, well, we'll have to submit that to the government. You know how that is. And so many of them literally took off, and some of them said, I don't have a gun. I'm going to, believe it or not as many people had guns as you would think they did back then. They were an expense. And the Indian menace was over in Kentucky. But they went and said, well, the government will give us that. The government will give us our food. They didn't even have that. They had to take up collections in Louisville, Kentucky, after they got the boats, and they got one pot for every 30 men. Can you imagine? And people donated a slab of pork or some cornmeal, and they took off. But they were on half rations by the time they had to stop to rebuild the boats. That was terrible. They did all of this. They expected the usual 2 months advance pay. It had already been given to our brothers to the south, the Tennesseans. So they said, well, we'll pay you. We'll take care of it. The Kentuckians came on, and they finally get to, they're still on the river when the British come in to Lake Bourne and attack our American gunboats. And they overwhelm them with smaller boats from their the big Navy, and they mount these little 1 and 3 pounders on these ships, and they swarm the 5 boats, and Andrew Jackson is desperate. To Billy Carroll, he wrote, hasten, our lakes are open to the enemy. I am prepared to die in the last ditch before they shall reach our city. John Coffee, you must not sleep until you reach me. He sent similar letters to John Hines of Mississippi Territory and John Thomas of the Kentucky Militia. At that time, we got the bad news. They came out on the Villeray plantation. They had come through the Bayou Mazant, and they were there was nothing separating them except a line of ditches. And we talked about the arpents today, the long, narrow strips with drainage ditches that actually drain back towards the bayous. And so at that point in time, they come out on Villaray's plantation, and there he is right there. And they have to report this to Jackson, and I'm moving quickly. But Jackson is supposedly, he was very sick. He was 6 feet tall. He weighed less than 140 pounds. He was a rack of bones, and he was suffering from dysentery. And the medicine they were giving him was killing him. It didn't help at all. But he rose up and he slammed and said, "By the eternal, they shall not sleep on our soil. We fight tonight." And so he could say that with some confidence because the Tennesseans arrived. The first advance guard started arriving at a plantation upriver, and they write about them. The appearance was not very military. In their woolen hunting shirts and compress dyed pantaloons, with slouched hats made from the skins of raccoons or foxes, with belts of untanned deer skin, in which were stuck their hunting knives and tomahawks, with their long, unkempt hair and unshorn faces. And they went on and said some other bad things, how bad they looked. People from New Orleans turned out to see them, and whew, did you get a smell of them? But they said they were admirable soldiers. They looked like they meant business, and said in soldiers they'll be able to take care of themselves. So we saw this drawing. This is one of the early maps again, and this is the Carolina that was part of Jackson's plans. He was going to drive down the levee road with the Marines. He said, "These British have come here. We're going to give them a smack in the nose from the very beginning. They're not expecting that. And we're going to make them think twice before they take this city." So he has the Carolina slip down even with the British lines and camps. And then he drives down the levee road quietly with the Marines, and the Tennesseans, who are adept at Indian fighting, and they sneak out through the plantations, the cypress woods, and they're going to come in from behind. And so that's exactly what they do. Coffee's hunters. Patterson lets go the ship. The Carolina opens fire. Jackson has 2 cannons, and he tells the Marines, open fire. And then when the British, they're getting 1-2 punch, and then here come the Tennesseans, coming out of the darkness, and they look like wild animals, and they're shooting, and they're very good fighters. They know how to fight. The British are rocked back on their heels a little bit, but then they get control. They bring up troops, and Jackson says, "Save the guns, my boys," and he withdraws behind the Rodriguez Canal and takes up residence in the McCarthy plantation. The British, they feel like they know what's going to happen because Jackson begins, that's where Arsène Latour, they say you're going to have to build a defensive position. The best place was right here, Rodriguez Canal. It happened to be the deepest ditch, plus the cypress woods bowed in, and when you've got a large number, you want to funnel it all down where you can, hit them with the most concentrated power. So Jackson's men began digging the ditches and making a barrier that was going to be very hard to catch with mud and earth and logs. And so that they dug out the drainage ditch, and he said, "I will build a rampart the enemy shall not breach." And this was the famous line Jackson, which I've walked several times, did the research for Witter's Landing to get it all correct, and interviewed the military experts, and I hope that all the stuff combined, because you get a lot. You all, if you all are into history, you'll look at several different sources, and you have to say, well, who was writing that, and what time was this written? Moving on, we've got Hunters of Kentucky. We'll spare you. Get ready though. Look at verse 5. We'll be doing that in a bit. On December 28th, the reconnaissance in force almost broke the back of Jackson's left wing. The British didn't know how close they'd come to taking that. They saw the dirty shirts over on the left wing. The Kentuckians were still coming down the river. Where were the Kentuckians? These were Tennesseans. The Tennessee hunters ventured out at night, and the next morning they would go in and find British guards with their throats slit. And there were also some Indians in the group. And so they was, "Sir, don't send me out there." And some of them were actually having near nervous breakdowns because they were asked to guard at night. Moving on, Jackson heard that a shipment of arms was coming down the river, but the government found out, "Oh, no," said, we found a cheaper way to get them to you, flatboats. So, so they weren't going to make it in time. Then Jackson found out that only 1 in 3 Kentuckians actually had a weapon. And only 1 in 10 had a battlefield-capable gun. Some of them were squirrel guns, pea shooters, shotguns. And he said, I don't believe it. I've never seen a Kentuckian without a gun, a pack of cards, and a jug of whiskey in all my life. And so he said, he was furious. Unbeknownst to all, Henry Clay and the peace delegation, Monroe and others, had signed the Treaty of Ghent. Now, it had not been ratified by the U.S. Senate nor by Parliament, but a peace treaty was, we could have said hold the phone, but that technology didn't exist. And the Kentuckians started pouring in between the 4th and the 7th of January. If the New Orleanians were shocked by the Tennesseans, they were horrified by the sight of the Kentuckians, skin and bones, clutching at holes in their clothing, and many of them unarmed. The Louisiana legislature voted for $6,000 for the Kentuckians. Local citizens raised another $10,000, and women started sewing together garments and things for the Kentuckians. John A. Darrett had to take over for General John Thomas, and he said, put us with Carroll's Tennesseans in reserve if necessary. So on the front line, about 680, you'll see 715 Kentuckians were put on the front line, and most of them, those were the ones that had some pretty good guns as well. Others got into the arsenal and were able to take the 75 caliber Spanish escopeta, and some of those had been semi-refurbished. It was one of those shoot it at your own risk, and they were sent across the river on the western side of the river. The Battle of New Orleans took place, and the first thing that went off was a Congreve rocket that went straight into the air, screaming, and it was the same. And the rocket's red glare. That was that type of rocket that was written about. And so people looked at it like Christ on Ascension Day, And out of the fog came the British Army, the #1 superpower in the world. We see different sketches of the battle. We've got Latour's and Hyacinth Laclotte. The one thing about this battle, it was over with in 45 minutes. The British tried several rushes. They tried to break the line. They got to the line, but they were hurled back each time. And it was just, it was a near-run thing. It was one of the closest battles in history, but it was also one of the most lopsided. It wasn't like this. You'll see these stylized paintings, Andrew Jackson, hold them, men, or standing up on cotton bales, fight them. No, he was moving like a conductor, keeping things going because, you have to do that. You have to keep one part of the army in contact with the other. And again, this is the hats. No, they didn't have they had checkered caps. And they weren't wearing their kilts that day. They had worn them in every battle and had won every battle. But when they put on their plaid trews, then the pants, they were defeated. It was near run, but look at what Jackson was having to fight with. Uniformed troops. He had some Navy troops. The Carolina had blown up, but they were able to get one of the big guns and have it on the line. He had pirates or smugglers, and Dominique was there. Also, you had your dirty shirted frontiersmen, free blacks, slaves, French, citizens. It was incredible what he had. It was lopsided. The cannon fire was devastating, but the Kentucky and Tennessee fire was very good. General Pakenham, so much promise placed into him, shot off his horse, got on it again, and was killed. In Kentucky, we honored Ephraim Brink. They claimed he did it. There's no documentation that happened. Okay? Other people, I killed Pakenham. No one really knows who did, except a historical fiction writer by the name of Eddie Price, who it was a Kentuckian. But that's why not, But moving on the west bank of the Mississippi, Colonel Thornton's brigade, they were behind. If that thing had happened at the right time, they would have been able to fire across at our line. But they were behind. The water level had dropped. They got there late. The Louisiana, Arnaud's men, there were only a few of them. fired and then fled back to the Kentucky lines. The Kentuckians got a couple of shots off, and then they ran, and wisely so. And then, of course, they fled toward Morgan's line, and it was rough. By the time Patterson's batteries are going to be taken, he's so angry, he blames the Kentuckians. He said, I saw them running like rabbits. And so he said, that's the reason why we lost that. Now, Jackson had won the big victory, so it was a moot point, but he wanted to know what had happened. And he got all these conflicting reports. And when he wrote his official report, Andrew Jackson said the Kentucky reinforcements, of whom so much was expected, ingloriously fled, drawing after them by example the remainder of the forces, thus yielding to the enemy a most formidable position. Well, there were generals in our army, Adair and others. Patterson's report was even more condemning. He said, they were flying in a most shameful and dastardly manner, almost without a shot. Now, that was a lie, and some of the people knew it, and they reported that. And so Jackson later pressed Jackson for, Adair, who was our commander, went to Jackson. He knew him personally, good friends, and said, I want you to take that back. That's not what happened. Jackson would not do it. And he got some pretty nasty letters from Henry Clay. Henry Clay hated him. Remember, Clay is going to throw his support towards John Quincy Adams in the 1824 election in the corrupt bargain. And he knocks Jackson out of the chance to win. So Jackson's got to come back in 1828 and win. But later, can you believe it, Jackson uses Hunters of Kentucky, uses it for his campaign song. I think that might have been some to niggle Henry Clay. People weren't all happy with Clay in Kentucky, even though he was a favorite son. There were a lot that didn't like his tariff or his national bank. But Hunters of Kentucky was one of the campaign songs. Jackson did in 1828 print a retraction. And he said, well, I had some good Kentuckians on the main line, yes. And maybe it is excusable that they fled. So it was a retraction of sorts. Here's the big thing, take away from this. If Kentucky and Tennessee had not been here, this battle would have been different. We comprised 50%, close to 50% of all the troops here, and 2/3 of the engaged forces. So when you've got Kentucky provided the largest contingency, and so that is very important. And this was the instrument that won the war, the Lancaster or the Kentucky rifle. It got its name from verse 5. Is that right? Wait a minute. Let's see. Yes, it is. Are you ready? I want to hear you this time. Okay. Verse 5. But Jackson, he was wide awake and not scared a trifle. For well he knew what aim we'd take with our Kentucky rifles. So he led us down by Cypress Swamp. The ground was low and lucky. And there stood John Bull and Marshall Pop. And here was old Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. So that is pretty much the Lancaster, Pennsylvania rifle. The big thing is this to remember, when the moon rose over Chalmette Plantation, it sent a message to the world. America was here to stay. Thank you.